Hi, my name is Joko and welcome to our channel where we talk all things trucking and give interesting tips and tricks for drivers just like yourself. In today's video, we will actually talk about how to properly perform a pre-trip inspection as required by the DOT. What you want to look for is scan the vehicle for exterior damage from the top to the bottom. As we can see, there is no exterior damage. What you also want to look for is check underneath the vehicle for any dragging parts, metal, plastic, anything hanging from underneath. Not only that, but you're also looking for any oil leaks, coolant leaks, fuel leaks, or anything of that sort that you may find underneath the tractor. Once everything checks out, lights are in place, mirrors are in place, there is no exterior damage, you want to continue, go pop the hood, and continue to the passenger side of the engine compartment. First and foremost, remember, metal parts cannot be cracked, bent, or broken. Rubber parts cannot have any bulges, scratches, or cuts. Electrical wires cannot have any frays, cuts, or exposed wire. Anything that has liquid or air in it cannot be leaking, and everything needs to be properly mounted and secured. We want to generally inspect the entire passenger engine bay area. We'll start with our coolant reservoir. Our coolant reservoir is properly mounted and secured with the proper hardware. It's not cracked, bent, or broken. It's not leaking any coolant. It's filled with coolant actually above the minimum line as per the manufacturer's specifications. The cap is tied on and it has no cracks, bends, or is not broken. And all the connecting hoses are connected on both ends properly with no leaks, bulges, scratches, or cuts. Next, we have our radiator. It's properly mounted and secured with the proper hardware. It's not cracked, bent, or broken. On this side, we have also our water pump. In certain situations, the water pump may be gear driven or belt driven. In our case, it is belt driven. So what we want to make sure is that our belt has no cuts. It's properly mounted and secured, and that there is no more than from 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch of free play. If it's gear driven, you want to make sure that the gears are properly mounted and secured, just like the water pump. And what we want to transition into now is our suspension part. We'll start off with our shock absorber. The shock absorber is properly mounted and secured on both ends with nuts and bolts. It's not cracked, bent, or broken, and it's not leaking any fluids. Next, we have our leaf spring hangers. They are properly mounted and secured, and they're not cracked, bent, or broken. Leaf springs, they're properly mounted and secured on both ends. They're not cracked, bent, or broken. Our leaf springs are connected to our front axle with U-bolts. The U-bolts are properly mounted and secured. They're not cracked, bent, or broken. And in this case, we don't have a front airbag, but some tractors do have front airbags as an additional suspension part. You want to mention that, and the way you want to say it is that your airbag is properly mounted and secured on both top and bottom. It has no cracks, no cuts, and no abrasions, and it's also not leaking air. We want to continue with our braking system on this side. We can see our air line and electrical line for the ABS are properly mounted and secured on both ends. They're not cracked, bent, or broken. The electrical line is not frayed, cut, or any wire exposed. Our brake chamber is properly mounted and secured. It's not cracked, bent, or broken. It's not leaking any air either. We have our push rod is properly mounted and secured. It's not cracked, bent, or broken. We have our slack adjuster properly mounted and secured. It's not cracked, bent, or broken. And then if we go on the inside, we also have our brake shoes and brake drum. Our brake shoes are properly mounted and secured. They're not cracked, bent, or broken. There is no grease or debris stuck between the brake shoe and the brake drum, which would, eventually prevent it from effectively braking. And the thickness of the brake shoe is no less than 1/4 of an inch. So now we continue with our tire. The top of our tire is evenly worn, as we can see. There is no big pieces missing from the tire. It's above the minimum thread depth of 4/32. It's not leaking air, and there is no bulges, cuts, or abrasions. The side of the tire as well, no abrasions, cuts, or any bulges that we can see. It's not leaking air. The tire is properly attached to our rim. There is no bulges, no cuts. There is no illegal welds on the rim. It's not cracked, bent, or broken. Our valve is also not cracked, bent, or broken. It's properly attached and it's not leaking air. We have our lug nuts on our rim, which are properly attached tightly. They're not cracked, bent, or broken, and there is no rust around the lug nuts, which would indicate that some of them are loose and that they have moved a little bit. Next, we have our hub seal, which is properly attached with the proper mounting hardware. All the bolts are present. It's not leaking any fluid, and the cap is tightly on. And as I said, it's not leaking any fluid and it's filled as per manufacturer's specifications. This would conclude our passenger side pre-trip inspection. So now we can go up to the driver's side. All right, so once we're done with the passenger side of our tractor, we come over to the driver's side and we want to follow the same steps that we did before. Work our way from the top to the bottom. And remember, metal parts cannot be cracked, bent, or broken. Rubber cannot have any bulges, cuts, or any abrasions. And electrical cannot have any frays, any wires exposed, any cuts in them. Anything that has liquid or air in it cannot be leaking, and everything must be properly mounted and secured. That being said, we continue. We talked about our coolant reservoir and our radiator from the other side. So on this side, we will start off with our alternator. It's not cracked, bent, or broken. Our alternator is properly mounted and secured. It is belt driven. We want to make sure is that our belt has no cuts. It's properly mounted and secured, and that there is no more than from 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch of free play. All the wires going in and coming out of the alternator have no frays. There are no exposed wires. There is no cuts. Everything is properly mounted and secured. Next, we will have our power steering fluid canister reservoir. Properly mounted and secured with the proper mounting hardware. It's not cracked, bent, or broken. It's not leaking any power steering fluid. Cap is tied on. Next, we have our engine oil dipstick, which is properly mounted and secured. It's not cracked, bent, or broken. It's not leaking any oil. All these wires here, we want to make sure that they're properly mounted and secured on both ends. There is no abrasions, no cuts, no bulges. If it's an electrical wire, we want to make sure that it has no frays, no wires showing, or no cuts. Just like here, there's a bunch of wires, a bunch of hoses. We want to make sure that there's no air leaking, no fluid leaking. In many cases, we won't be able to see the compressor, but if you can see the compressor, you want to make sure that you mention that it's properly mounted and secured with proper mounting hardware. It's not cracked, bent, or broken, and it's not leaking any air. Now, the next part, what we'll talk about is our steering components, our suspension components, and our braking components. First, let's talk about our steering components. We have our steering shaft or steering column. It's properly mounted and secured. It's not cracked, bent, or broken. Our steering column is mounted to our steering gearbox with universal joints or U-joints. They're properly mounted and secured, properly greased, and they're not cracked, bent, or broken. Next, we have our steering gearbox. It's properly mounted and secured to our frame with the proper mounting hardware. It's not cracked, bent, or broken, and it's not leaking any fluids. Both hoses coming in and out have no bulges, no abrasions, no cuts, and they're properly mounted and secured on both ends. Below our steering gearbox, we have our pitman arm. Our pitman arm is properly mounted and secured on both ends. It's not cracked, bent, or broken, and it's secured with castle nuts and a cotter pin. Next, we have our drag link. Our drag link is properly mounted and secured on both ends with a castle nut and a cotter pin. It's not cracked, bent, or broken. Next, we have our steering arm. Our steering arm is properly mounted and secured. It's not cracked, bent, or broken. And down there, we have our tie rod, which is properly mounted and secured on both ends. It's not cracked, bent, or broken. Next, we want to go to our suspension parts. Suspension, we'll start off with our shock absorber. Our shock absorber is properly mounted and secured on both ends with the proper mounting hardware. It's not cracked, bent, or broken, and it's not leaking any fluids. Leaf spring hangers, they are properly mounted and secured, and they're not cracked, bent, or broken. Next, we have our leaf springs. Our leaf springs are all accounted for. They're properly mounted and secured on both ends. They're not cracked, bent, or broken. Our leaf springs are connected to our front axle with U-bolts. Our U-bolts are properly mounted and secured, and they have no cracks. they're not bent or broken. In some cases, you will also have an airbag present in the front steering axle of the truck. If you do have an airbag, what you want to do is you want to mention that the airbag is properly mounted and secured on both ends. The rubber of the airbag is not bulged, it has no cuts or any scratches, and it's also not leaking air. Now we'll continue with our braking system. Our braking system will start off with our rubber hose, with our air hose and electrical wire hose going into the brake chamber. The air hose is properly mounted and secured on both ends. It's not bulged, scratched, or cut, and is not leaking air. Our electrical wire is also properly mounted and secured on both ends. It's not frayed, cut, or has any exposed wire. Our brake chamber is properly mounted and secured with the proper mounting hardware. It's not cracked, bent, or broken, and it's not leaking any air. We have our push rod, which is properly mounted and secured, no cracks, bent, or broken. We have our slack adjuster, which is properly mounted and secured with no cracks, bends, or broken. On the inside here, we have our brake shoes and our brake drum. Both are properly mounted and secured. There is no cracks, they're not bent or broken, and there is no grease in between the brake shoes and the brake drum. And the thickness of the brake shoe is no less than 1/4 inch. Now we'll continue on with the tire. Our tire is properly mounted and secured to our steering axle. There is no abrasions, cuts, or scratches on top of the tire or on the side of the tire, and there is no major parts missing. The thread depth is no less than 4/32. We continue down, no abrasions, no cuts. We want to make sure that it's well touching the rim and that there is no air leaks. Our rim itself is properly mounted and secured. There is no illegal welds, it's not cracked, bent, or broken. We want to make sure that it's also not leaking air where it meets the rubber on the side. Our valve is properly mounted and secured. It's not cracked, bent, or broken, and it's not leaking any air. We have our lug nuts, which are holding our rim to our axle. They're properly mounted and secured, no cracks, bent, or broken, and there is no rust around the lug nuts, which would indicate that they might be loose and they might be shifted. We have our hub seal, which is properly mounted and secured with the cap. It's filled with fluid as per manufacturer's specifications, and it's currently not leaking any lubricant fluid. And that will conclude our driver's side engine bay compartment. Next, we continue on the driver's side, moving towards the back of the tractor. So on the driver's side of the truck, what we want to talk about, there's a few different things. Again, we want to start from the top to the bottom. Metal parts cannot be cracked, bent, or broken, and everything must be properly secured in its place. First, we'll start off with our mirror. Our mirror is properly attached and secured to our cabin frame with the proper mounting hardware. The mirror is clear and it's not cracked or broken. Next, we have our door. Our door is properly attached and secured to our cabin as well with the proper mounting hardware, the hinges. It's not cracked, bent, or broken. The seal around the door is properly attached and secured, and it has no cuts, abrasions, or any bulges in it. And the door is working properly. It opens and closes. Next, we have our steps. They're properly attached and secured. They're not cracked, bent, or broken, and they can support the weight of the driver. Here we have our DEF system fueling port, which is properly attached and secured, not cracked, bent, or broken, with our DEF system fuel cap, which is tied on. We want to bend down and make sure that we don't have any DEF leaking. This is our marker light, which also serves as a turn signal, a 4-way flasher, and a marker light. Like I said, it's amber in color. And now once you come here to the back, we have our fueling tank, which is properly mounted and secured. It's not cracked, bent, or broken, and it's not leaking any fuel. The fuel cap is tied on. We have our fuel tank steps, properly mounted and secured. They're not cracked, bent, or broken, and they can support the weight of the driver. In our case, we have disconnected the tractor from the trailer for instructional purposes, but when you perform your pre-trip inspection with an examiner, with a DOT examiner, you will actually be hooked to a trailer. But for educational purposes, I have unhooked just so I can show better what parts you need to be pointing out to. The catwalk is properly mounted and secured to the frame of the tractor with the proper mounting hardware. It's not cracked, bent, or broken. We have the frame itself, it's properly mounted and secured, it's not cracked, bent or broken, and there is no illegal welds on the frame either. Here, we can see down here is our drive shaft, and we have our differential drive shaft. Our drive shaft is properly mounted and secured with U-joints on both sides. The U-joints are also properly mounted and secured, they're properly greased, and there is no cracks, it's not bent or it's not broken, nor is the U-joints or the drive shaft. With some tractors, you also have your exhaust will be visible from the back of the cabin. In this case, it's not, it's down below. And you want to make sure that you mention that it's properly mounted and secured, it's not leaking, and it's not cracked, bent, or broken. If I turn myself this way, we can see our connections. Now, we are disconnected from the trailer for educational purposes only, but when you are performing your exam, you will be hooked to a trailer, so where I'm standing right now, you won't be able to stand, and these coupling cables will be connected to the trailer. Let's start off with the electrical wire. The electrical wire needs to be connected, properly secured on both the tractor and the trailer. There is no frays, no cuts, no scratches on the wire, and there is no wires exposed. The blue and the red line need to be properly attached and secured on both ends on the tractor and the trailer. There is no abrasions, bulges, or any cuts, and they're not leaking air. Both glad hands should have a rubber seal, or also known as a grommet. The seal should not have any abrasions, cuts, or scratches. It should be fully intact. And the glad hand also cannot be cracked, bent, or broken. Also, when it's connected to the trailer, it cannot be leaking air. The same goes for both glad hands, for the red line and the blue line. To continue, we have our utility lights properly attached and secured. They're clear in color, they're not cracked, bent, or broken. And there is no obstructions on the light. Up top, we have our reflectors. They're both properly attached and secured, clear in color. They're not cracked, bent, or broken. Now let's continue with our suspension parts of our drive axle. Now we have our leaf spring hangers are properly mounted and secured. They're not cracked, bent, or broken, and they're mounted with the proper mounting hardware. We have our leaf springs. They're properly mounted and secured. No cracks, no bends, no broken. Our U-bolts, properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, or broken. Next, we have our shock absorber, properly mounted and secured on both ends. It's not cracked, bent, or broken, and there is no fluid leaking. Next, we have our airbag. It's properly mounted and secured on both ends. There are no cuts, abrasions, or any bulges on the airbag, and it's not leaking any air. Let's continue. We have our leaf spring hanger, properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, or broken. Leaf springs, properly mounted and secured, no cracks, bends, or broken. U-bolts, properly mounted and secured, no cracks, bends, and broken. We have our shock absorber, properly mounted and secured on both ends with the proper mounting hardware, not cracked, bent, or broken, and it's not leaking any fluid. And we have our airbag, properly mounted and secured on both ends with the rubber not showing any bulges, cuts, or any scratches, and as well it's not leaking any air. Now that we've talked about the suspension, let's talk about the braking system as well. As we can see, here we have the electrical wire of the ABS. It's not frayed, cut, or it's not showing any wire, properly attached on both sides. Down here we have our brake chamber. Our brake chamber is properly mounted and secured. It's not cracked, bent, or broken, and it's not leaking any air. We have our push rod, which is properly mounted and secured. No cracks, bent, or broken. We have our slack adjuster, which is properly mounted and secured with no cracks, bends, or broken. Any hoses coming in and out of the brake chamber are properly attached and secured. There are no bulges, no cuts, and they're not leaking any air. We have our brake drums and brake shoes. They're properly attached, not cracked, bent, or broken, and there is no debris or no grease stuck between the brake shoe and the brake drum. And the thickness of the brake shoe is no less than 1/4 of an inch. And now let's go on this side. Next, we have our brake chamber, properly attached and secured. It's not cracked, bent, or broken, and it's not leaking any air. We have our push rod, which is properly mounted and secured. No cracks, bent, or broken. We have our slack adjuster, which is properly mounted and secured with no cracks, bends, or broken, and it's not leaking any air. Both hoses are properly attached and secured on both ends, and they're not leaking any air. And the electrical wire of the ABS is properly attached and secured. It's not frayed, or there is no wires exposed. Our brake shoes and brake drum are properly attached and secured, no visible cracks, it's not bent or broken, and there is no debris on the brake drum which would hinder us from braking. And the thickness of the brake shoe is no less than 1/4 of an inch. Now what we want to talk about is our tires. In this case, in the back we have duals, which means we'll have to do everything that we do for one tire, we have to do the same thing for the other tire. So first we have the inner tire. It's properly attached and secured to the frame. It has no bulges, no cuts, no abrasions, and the thread depth is no less than 2/32. The side of the tire, again, no bulges, abrasions, or cuts, and it's not leaking air. We have our rim. There is no illegal welds, it's properly attached and secured, no cracks, it's not bent or broken. We have our valve for the tire, it's properly attached and secured, not cracked, bent, or broken, and it's not leaking any air. The front of the tire, evenly worn throughout the entire tire with the thread depth of no less than 2/32. No abrasions, no cuts, no scratches, no major pieces missing, and it's not leaking any air. The same goes for the outside, no abrasions, cuts, or scratches. It's not leaking air, and it's properly mounted and secured to our rim. Our rim is properly mounted and secured with lug nuts. There's no illegal welds on it, and it's not cracked, bent, or broken. Our lug nuts are properly attached and secured. They're not cracked, bent, or broken, and there is no rust around them. Our hub seals are properly attached and secured. They're not leaking, and they're filled with the proper fluid as per manufacturer specifications. And we also have our valve, which is properly attached and secured, not leaking any air, and it's not cracked, bent, or broken. Now we do the same thing for these tires. The tire is properly attached and secured to the rim. It has no abrasions, no cuts, no scratches. It's evenly worn throughout, and it's no less than 2/32. It's attached to the rim, and there is no air leaking. The rim, there's no illegal welds. It's properly attached and secured, and it's not cracked, bent, or broken. We have our valve, which is properly attached and secured, and it's not cracked, bent, or broken. It's not leaking any air. We have the outside tire. It's properly attached and secured to our rim. It's evenly worn throughout the tire, and there is no major pieces missing. The minimum tire thread depth is no less than 2/32, and it's not leaking any air. There is no abrasions, no cuts, no scratches. Our rim, properly mounted and secured. There is no illegal welds. It's not cracked, bent, or broken, and it's not leaking any air from our tire. Next, we have our lug nuts. Our lug nuts are properly attached and secured with they're not cracked, bent, or broken. There is no rust around the lug nuts to indicate that they are loose, and all of them are present. We also have our valve, which is properly attached and secured. It's not cracked, bent, or broken, and it's not losing any air. Okay, so once we are finished with all 4 tires and the rims and everything, before we go to the back, what we want to do is we also want to mention that the mud flap is also properly attached and secured. It's not cracked, bent, or broken, and it's not missing. In order to save some time and make this video as short and educational as possible, I will not be inspecting any of the driving components, tires, brakes, suspension on the passenger side of this vehicle. But when you do perform your exam, keep in mind that you have to. So if you want, you can re-watch anything that we have done here and perform the same things on the other side as well. So once we're done with the tires, the suspension, the brakes, we move on to our fifth wheel or our coupling section. Now, to start it off, we'll go with our fifth wheel mounting plate, which is properly mounted and secured with the proper mounting hardware to our frame. It's not cracked, bent, or broken, and there's no bolts missing. Our fifth wheel itself is a sliding fifth wheel, so we want to make sure that the sliding pins are in their locked position, they're not cracked, bent, or broken, and that they're not missing. Our release arm is in the unlocked position in this case, but it will be in the locked position when you're hooked to a trailer. It's not cracked, bent, or broken, and it's not missing. We have our skid plate. Our skid plate is properly mounted and secured. It's not cracked, bent, or broken, and it's properly greased. What you have inside the cabin is a switch where you can activate and disengage the locking pins. In that case, that means that there is no pneumatic reservoir or components here in the fifth wheel, so you want to inspect those as well. And in this case, it's this little reservoir here. It's properly mounted and secured. It's not cracked, bent, or broken, and it's not leaking any air, as is the same air line here. properly mounted and secured on both ends. It's not bulges, no cuts and no abrasions, no scratches, and it's not leaking any air. Now if we go on this side of the fifth wheel, we'll be able to see our lock-in arms. In this case, they will be in the open position, but once we slide the kinpin in here, these lock-in arms, lock-in jaws, will close and prevent the kinpin from moving out. This concludes the major retractor components of the pre-trip inspection, and now what we want to do is inspect our trailer.